Okay, let's talk about the vocoder. The vocoder is a lot of fun, but it's a bit tricky to use in your songs, and I'm sure a lot of people will get hung up on it. Part of the reason for that is because the vocoder is almost more of an effect than an actual synthesizer. The way the vocoder works is it takes a carrier signal, so usually something like a synth, and modulates it using a second signal called the modulator. In most of the examples you probably heard for a vocoder, a vocal sound was used as the modulator, and a normal kind of synth was used as the carrier. If we place a vocoder and try to play it, we won't hear any sounds, and we'll be invited to select a modulator. So let's start right away by the simplest case of a modulator, and let's record some voice. I'll press this button, so you can either load up an existing WAV file you had, or in this case, I'm going to go in the sample editor and record something myself. Transformers, robots in disguise. Now the trick with recording vocals for use in the modulator is to articulate. The more you articulate, the better chance you have at recognizing what's actually coming out at the other end. I'm just going to quickly trim this and normalize it. Normalizing is quite important as well. I'll call my recording Transformers. And those of you who grew up in the 80s like me know exactly where I'm going with this. So the vocoder's got an internal synth you can use, but you can also use an external synth as a carrier. I'll give an example of that later. The internal synth has two oscillator types, so square wave and sawtooth. What we want is an oscillator that produces a lot of harmonics and a lot of frequencies. There's a sub-oscillator you can add for a bit more bass. We can put in some noise. We can control the articulation of the vocoder using the slew parameter. This is pretty much like the articulation of it. There's a high frequency bypass if we want to bring in some of the original sound, but just the high frequency. This usually helps to discern what's being said in the vocoder. It's a bit of a trick. And we can also mix in some dry signal, so the actual signal that was recorded. Now, if you're going to have your vocoder sing notes, it's not really important that the modulation source is sung or even to pitch. That's because what the vocoder does is it extracts the frequencies from the modulator and replaces that with content from the carrier. So if I play this recorded modulator with a chord here on the synth,
Transformers,
so you can hear the synth is kind of singing what I've recorded.
Transformers, Transformers, Transformers,
And let's just play around with the synth and I'll show you the different options. So square wave.
Transformers,
Unison is kind of a doubling of the oscillator in a detuned way, so it kind of gives a nice flanging effect.
Transformers, Transformers,
Sub-oscillator.
Transformers, Transformers,
Noise.
Transformers, Transformers,
So the noise kind of helps bring out the vocals.
Transformers,
Slew. So this would be fully articulate.
Transformers, Transformers,
You can hear how that sort of muffles everything.
Transformers,
High frequency bypass.
Transformers, Transformers, Transformers,
And dry signal.
Transformers,
Transformers. Transformers. So if you've got something you've sung and it's on key with what you're going to play on the keyboard, you can actually use the dry to get kind of a doubled up effect.
Transformers,
Up here is character control, and that controls the amount. It's basically an EQ, and it controls the character of the vocoded signal that comes out.
Transformers, Transformers, robots, Transformers, Transformers.
So the vocoder usually works better with lower octave stuff as the carrier source because it tends to be richer in harmonics and various frequencies. So for my example here, I could play something in the lower notes.
Transformers, robots in disguise.
So the notes I play kind of make the modulator sing it. So I could play anything.
Transformers, robots in disguise.
Now let's look at how you'd use your vocoder in a song. This is the bit that gets a bit trickier. So I'm going to record over this nice Transformers thing and record something. Let's say I want to make the next club hit for some kind of dance song. So I'm going to take a reference on what my BPM click track is. All right, so now I'll record myself saying something and we'll play around with it in a pattern. Everybody dance. Okay. Remember to normalize.
Everybody dance. Everybody dance.
All right, we'll bring in a bit of bypass, and
Everybody, everybody dance.
all right, so this is the tricky bit. If we go down to the pattern editor, so right now I've just been previewing with the preview keyboard, and that works right away.
Everybody dance.
And I've recorded into modulation source 1. You get 6 modulation slots you can use, and each one of those can be either a waveform or it can also be another machine. I'll get to the machine bit in a second. So if we go down here and we place our chord, or just our few notes, let's say we want to press . So if we press these notes, and that's what, if I press them up here,
Everybody dance.
so that's what I want. Now, if we just put these in the pattern and hit play, we're not actually hearing it. That's because, remember, the vocoder is 2 parts, the carrier and the modulator. So if we go all the way down the piano roll here, you'll see the list of modulation sources. So I've got the old one, and it's still called Transformers, but this is the one I've recorded into. So what we have to do is put in essentially a note trigger, but rather than playing note C1, it's going to activate our modulator at this time. The length of the note will determine how long the sample is going to be playing for. So we can use that to restart the sample midway or trim it off halfway if we want. So in this case, I want it to play over 3 beats. And so now if we hit play on this, we'll get the combination of our selected modulator and the notes we want to play.
Everybody dance. Everybody dance.
So to show you what I mean by re-triggering, we can place an extra note here. And down here in the modulator slot, I can do something like this, where it's going to re-trigger the sample to play, but just for a short bit, and then re-trigger it to play again. So we get this.
Everybody dance. Everybody dance. Everybody dance. Everybody dance.
So up till now, I've been using the internal oscillator as the carrier source. We can also use another synth as the carrier. If you're not happy with the sound you can get from these, you can extend it by using a full other synth. So I'm going to add a subsynth in another slot, load up a preset, and in my vocoder, select the subsynth as the carrier. Now, if I press play, my notes are being sent, but it's not actually vocoding anything. That's because the notes are being sent to the internal synth here, but aren't necessarily being sent to the subsynth. So what I can do is I can put notes in here, but in the easier case, I've already set up my notes in my pattern here. So what I can do is just press this button, and that will send the notes that are from the vocoder to the carrier synth. So now if I hit press play, not quite right, is it? Because we hear our subsynth, but we don't really hear the vocoded result. So the reason that's happening is because our subsynth is producing audio and it's connected to this mixer line. So while we want it to produce audio because we're going to be using it as our carrier source, we don't want it coming out as the dry signal. So what we can do is mute the subsynth in the mixer. And now if we press play,
Everybody dance. Everybody dance. Everybody dance.
and now we can play with the synth. You know, you can automate it and get more elaborate results.
Everybody dance. Everybody dance. Everybody dance. Everybody dance.
Now we've used a vocal track as the modulation source. We can also use another machine. Certain machines work better than others. Drum kits tend to be a really nice modulation source for kind of a special effect. If you pick a drum source that's got a lot of frequency, so probably not a very natural drum kit, these electronic drum kits tend to work better. So I'll set something up kind of random. Okay, so if I just listen to that. Perfect. So back to our vocoder, and on modulation source 2, we'll press the machine button and we'll select the beatbox as our modulation source. Let's select a new pattern. And right now, if we just play a note, nothing happens because I'm relying on the beatbox to be outputting sound to be the source of my modulation. So if we press play, well, again, we have the problem of the beatbox coming out in the mixer. So again, we have to mute it. Now, if I press a note while it's playing, so now in this case, the vocoder is only being used as an insert because our carrier comes from the subsynth and the modulation source comes from the beatbox. If we want to create a pattern that sets this up, we need to make sure we activate our beatbox modulator in the pattern. And I'll just turn it on for the whole duration. And up here, I'll set up a few chords, just a demo. There we go. So now if I press play and if I use this pattern in a song, so that's it for the vocoder. The key thing is to remember to be triggering your modulation source. I'm sure a lot of people will get stuck on this, but hopefully if you watch this video, you won't be one of those people. It's really important because you need to say which of your modulation sources. You know, you could swap between the two and have it halfway through trigger the wave file on modulator 1.
Everybody dance.
You know, so it's very important that you choose which modulator you're using. If you want to use more than 6 modulation sources, what you can do is, as the modulation source, use a PCM synth, and there you get 64 samples you can record. And so from there, you can trigger different notes that map to different samples. And so you can go crazy with a whole bunch of little vocal clips that go into the modulation source for the vocoder. And so there's a lot of options with this synth. All right, we'll go ahead and try the vocoder and go forth and be robots.
Caustic 3.